August 1936. The world was on the brink of change, but for the crew of the SS Boreas, the only world that mattered was the endless, shifting white of the high Arctic. Led by the brilliant but obsessive Captain Erik Vance, a team of 12 scientists and seasoned sailors set sail from Norway. Their mission was ambitious: to reach the 79th parallel and locate a suspected magnetic anomaly that was interfering with global navigation systems. They were equipped with the best technology of the era, enough supplies for 2 years, and a conviction that they would return as heroes. But the Arctic is not a place that welcomes heroes. It is a place that swallows them. 6 months into the expedition, the last radio transmission from the SS Boreas was received. It was short, distorted by heavy atmospheric static, and utterly chilling. Captain Vance didn't report icebergs or mechanical failure. He simply said, "The shadows here have weight. We are stopping the engines. Tell them, it's not an anomaly. It's a pulse." After that, the 79th parallel went silent. Search missions were launched in 1938 and 1940, but not a single splinter of wood or scrap of sail was ever found. The SS Boreas became the ghost of the North, a cautionary tale for every sailor who dared to look too far into the white blindness. Fast forward 90 years to the summer of 2026. Climate change has done what decades of search parties could not. It has peeled back the ancient skin of the Arctic. A specialized glaciology team, using high-resolution thermal imaging satellites, noticed a strange heat signature coming from a remote, unnamed island near the Svalbard archipelago. This island was supposed to be a solid block of permafrost, yet the sensors showed a localized hot spot that pulsed every 14 minutes. Driven by scientific curiosity, a modern research vessel, the Borealis Echo, was dispatched. When the team landed their drones on the island's northern ridge, they didn't find a shipwreck. They found a campsite, but it wasn't a camp from 1936. It looked like it had been set up yesterday. The tents were made of heavy, wax-treated canvas, typical of the 1930s, yet they were not torn by the brutal Arctic winds. There was no snow covering them, despite the island being in the middle of a perpetual blizzard zone. As the lead scientist, Dr. Elena Rostova, stepped off the helicopter, she noticed something that made her blood run colder than the surrounding ice. Lying just outside the main tent was a copper kettle. It was sitting on a small stove. When Elena touched it, she pulled her hand back in shock. The kettle was warm. Steam was still rising from its spout, but there was no one in sight. No footprints in the soft, dark soil around the camp. Just the rhythmic, low-frequency hum that seemed to be vibrating through the very soles of her boots. "This is impossible," Elena whispered into her comms. "This camp has been here for 90 years, but the biology of this place, it hasn't aged. The canvas isn't brittle. The leather boots near the entrance aren't cracked. It's like the island has frozen time itself." As they moved toward the captain's tent, they found the first piece of the puzzle. Propped up against a wooden crate was a heavy, leather-bound logbook. The cover was scorched, as if it had been exposed to intense heat, but the pages inside were crisp and white. Elena opened the book to the final entry, dated February 14, 1937. The handwriting started as a neat, military script but ended in a frantic, jagged scrawl that dug deep into the paper. "The sun has not risen for 40 days, but the island is glowing. We have found the source of the pulse. It is not in the earth, it is under the ice. We tried to leave, but the compasses no longer point north. They point down. Miller went into the fog today. He came back, but he is not Miller anymore. His eyes, they look like the aurora." At that moment, the 14-minute pulse hit. A wave of violet light erupted from the center of the island, and for a split second, The modern research team saw the SS Boreas sitting perfectly intact in the bay, only to have it vanish as quickly as a ghost in the wind. The violet pulse subsided, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavier than the Arctic wind. Dr. Elena Rostova stood frozen, her hand still gripping the 90-year-old logbook. On the horizon, where the ghost image of the SS Boreas had just flickered, there was nothing but jagged ice and the dark, churning sea. "Did everyone see that?" Her tech lead, Sam, crackled over the radio. His voice was trembling. The thermal sensors just spiked to 40 degrees Celsius and then dropped to -30 in 3 seconds. That shouldn't be physically possible. Elena didn't answer. She was staring at the ground. Around the 1930s tent, there was a small patch of moss. In the Arctic, moss grows at an agonizingly slow rate, taking decades to cover a few inches. But as she watched, the green fibers were visibly crawling over a discarded tin of biscuits. It was growing in fast forward, responding to the remnants of the violet energy. "The pulse isn't just heat," Elena whispered, kneeling down. "It's a localized acceleration of biological time. Or perhaps a distortion of it." She led the team into the main command tent. Inside, the scene was hauntingly domestic. A heavy oak table was set for a meal. Plates of dried beef and hardtack sat uncovered. To any other observer, it looked like the crew had stepped out for a breath of air. But Elena noticed the anomalies. A fountain pen was suspended an inch above a journal, held in midair by a shimmering distortion in the air. A drop of spilled coffee was frozen in time, shaped like a perfect glass bead, halfway between the table and the floor. "They didn't leave," Sam said, pointing his flashlight toward the back of the tent. "They were interrupted." In the corner sat a large, brass-bound machine that looked like a cross between a telegraph and a telescope. It was humming, the same low-frequency vibration they had felt in their boots. Wires ran from the machine, not into a battery, but directly into the permafrost floor. The ice around the entry point wasn't melting. It was turning into a translucent, crystalline violet. Elena picked up a smaller notebook lying next to the machine. It belonged to the expedition's physicist, Dr. Erik Vance. The notes were frantic, filled with complex equations that mixed 1930s physics with concepts that wouldn't be theorized for another 80 years. February 18th, 1937. The anomaly at the 79th parallel is not magnetic. It is a loom, a tear in the fabric where time pools like water in a basin. The pulse is the loom breathing. We tried to map the frequency, but the machine has bonded with the island's core. Every 14 minutes, the island resets. We are becoming part of the reset. My skin is translucent. I can see the stars through my own palms. Dr. Thorne wasn't crazy, Elena muttered, her eyes widening. He discovered a temporal pocket. This island isn't moving through time at the same rate as the rest of the world. To us, they've been gone for 90 years. To them, how long has it been? Days. Hours. Suddenly, the 14-minute mark approached again. The air began to shimmer. The suspended fountain pen began to vibrate. "Sam, get the recording equipment ready. We need to capture the transition," Elena commanded. But as the air grew thick with ozone, a shadow fell across the tent opening. It wasn't the shadow of a modern researcher. It was tall, wearing a heavy, fur-lined parka from a bygone era. The figure didn't walk. It seemed to slide into existence as the violet light began to glow from beneath the ice. The man raised a hand. His skin was exactly as Thorne had described, luminous and clear, like frosted glass. Through his chest, Elena could see the flickering embers of the stove behind him. "Captain Vance." Elena breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The figure's lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, The words appeared as frost on the lenses of Elena's goggles. Stop. The pulse. As the second pulse hit, the tent erupted in a blinding flash. When Elena's vision cleared, Sam was gone. The tent was empty. And on the oak table, where there had been 3 plates of food, there were now 4. The 4th plate was modern. It was a plastic ration tray from the Borealis Echo. Sam's tray. The silence that followed Sam's disappearance was more than an absence of sound. It was a vacuum. Dr. Elena Rostova stared at the modern plastic ration tray sitting amidst the 1930s tin plates. It was a terrifying bridge between 2 eras. Sam hadn't just been moved. He had been integrated. Sam? Sam, do you copy? Elena's voice cracked over the comms, but all she heard was a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that seemed to sync with her own heartbeat. She checked her watch. The digital display was flickering wildly, numbers spinning backward and forward like a broken compass. The reset wasn't just a biological pulse. It was a physical rewriting of the environment. Every 14 minutes, the island attempted to normalize its timeline, pulling anything new into the old reality of 1937. Elena, look at the walls. Her remaining team member, Sarah, whispered from the tent entrance. The canvas of the tent was no longer just fabric. It was shimmering, turning into a translucent, organic membrane. Through the walls, they could see the Arctic landscape outside, but it wasn't the barren, icy rock they had landed on. It was a lush, prehistoric-looking forest of giant ferns and moss-covered trees, glowing with the same violet luminescence. The loom, Elena realized, clutching Dr. Thorne's notebook. It's not just 1937. It's a junction of multiple eras. The pulse is the shutter of a camera, and we're being caught in the exposure. Suddenly, the brass-bound machine in the corner began to spark. The violet crystals growing from the floor were now climbing up the table legs. Elena rushed to the machine, her fingers hovering over the dials. She saw a series of hand-etched markings on the brass casing, Thorne's last attempt to stabilize the frequency. To stop the pulse, one must become the ground, the note read. Elena, someone's coming. Sarah shouted. From the glowing forest outside, 3 figures emerged. They wore the fur-lined parkas of the SS Boreas crew, but they didn't walk like humans. Their movements were fluid, trailing echoes behind them as if they were moving through water. Leading them was Captain Vance. His face was a mask of crystalline glass, his eyes swirling with the colors of the aurora borealis. Beside him was a 4th figure. His movements were jerky, unfinished. He wore a modern bright orange thermal jacket, but the fabric was already beginning to fade into the dull gray of 1930s wool. Sam! Elena screamed. The figure turned. It was Sam, but his eyes were empty, reflecting the violet forest. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, a burst of high-frequency radio static erupted, knocking Elena and Sarah to the ground. The loom needs anchors, the static translated in Elena's mind. You are the final threads. The machine in the tent let out a deafening roar. The violet light intensified, turning the air into a thick, gelatinous mist. Elena realized that the pulse wasn't an accident. The SS Boreas crew hadn't just discovered the loom, they had been used by it. To keep the temporal pocket stable, the island required living consciousness to act as grounding wires. Sam was being converted into a 1937 anchor to replace a crew member who had finally faded away, and the island was already looking for its next set. We have to reverse the polarity, Elena yelled over the roar. She grabbed a heavy copper wrench and began to smash the violet crystals at the base of the machine. If we break the connection to the permafrost, The island will have to snap back to 2026. But as the wrench struck the crystal, the island fought back. The 14-minute mark was seconds away. The air turned a blinding white. Elena felt her feet losing contact with the ground. She looked down and saw her own boots, her modern, high-tech hiking boots, slowly turning into cracked, 1930s leather. "Don't resist," Sam's voice echoed, now sounding perfectly like a 1930s radio announcer. "The white is warm." The sensation of the transition was not like falling. It was like being dissolved in acid and rewritten in ink. Dr. Elena Rostova watched in horror as the high-tech Gore-Tex of her sleeves withered, the vibrant orange pigment bleeding out until it was the dull, scratchy gray of 1930s heavy wool. The digital watch on her wrist didn't just stop. It melted into a mechanical wind-up dial, the glass cracking as the internal gears forced themselves into existence. "Sarah, hold on to the machine." Elena screamed, but her voice sounded distant, as if she were shouting through a long, metallic pipe. Sarah was losing the battle. Her modern tactical helmet was morphing into a leather aviator cap, and her face was beginning to take on that terrifying, frosted glass translucency. She wasn't just changing clothes. Her very biology was being archived by the island. Outside the tent, the prehistoric violet forest was pulsing with a blinding intensity. The figures of Captain Vance and the new Sam stood at the threshold, their bodies flickering like a film reel caught in a projector. Sam was no longer Sam. He was a 1937 version of himself, a radio operator for an expedition that had vanished 90 years ago. He held a heavy, black Bakelite headset, his eyes fixed on the brass machine Elena was trying to destroy. The loom demands symmetry. The static hummed in Elena's mind. For every thread pulled from the future, an anchor must be cast in the past. Elena realized the horrifying mathematics of the 79th parallel. The island wasn't just a time pocket. It was a balancing scale. To bring the SS Boreas crew forward into 2026, her team had to be pushed back into 1937. They were being swapped. "I won't be your anchor," Elena roared. She swung the heavy copper wrench again, but this time, she didn't hit the crystals. She aimed for the brass machine's Chronos lens, the glass aperture at the top that was focusing the violet light into the tent. The glass shattered with a sound that felt like a lightning strike. Instantly, the violet light turned a chaotic, jagged red. The reset was interrupted. The prehistoric forest outside vanished, replaced by a terrifying void of swirling gray mist and flashes of different eras. A Viking longship crushed by ice, a Cold War nuclear submarine glowing with radiation, and a futuristic research station yet to be built. The loom was unraveling. "Elena, I can't feel my legs," Sarah cried. Her lower half was already solid 1937 matter, pinned to the floor by the weight of the past, while her torso was still flickering in 2026. Captain Vance stepped forward, his crystalline hand reaching for the broken lens. His face showed a flash of human agony. "If the lens stays broken, we all scatter into the void. There will be number 1937, number 2026. Only the silence." Elena looked at the shard of glass in her hand. If she fixed the machine, she would trap herself and Sarah in 1937 forever, but they would survive. If she left it broken, the island would collapse, erasing them, the SS Boreas, and perhaps the entire 79th parallel from history. She looked at Sam. He was crying, but his tears were small, glowing beads of violet mercury. He was the bridge. "The machine doesn't need the lens," Elena whispered, her eyes darting to Dr. Thorne's equations in the scorched logbook. "It needs a heartbeat. a organic frequency to override the loom's reset. She grabbed the copper wires trailing from the machine, the ones plugged into the violet ice. Without hesitation, she wrapped them around her own wrists, connecting her modern 2026 heartbeat directly into the 1937 circuitry. The surge was agonizing. Her vision turned into a kaleidoscope of static. She wasn't just Dr. Elena Rostova anymore. She was a signal. She was the 90-year gap between the two expeditions, narrowed down to a single, pulsing vein. The world didn't just scream. It vibrated at a frequency that threatened to liquefy Elena's bones. By wrapping the copper wires around her wrists, she had turned her own nervous system into a biological bridge. She was no longer a scientist observing a phenomenon. She was the conductor for 90 years of trapped temporal energy. Through the haze of static, she saw the environment around her begin to tear. The tent wall to her left showed the bleak, gray Arctic of 1937, where a blizzard was howling against the canvas. To her right, the wall showed the high-tech interior of the Borealis Echo in 2026, where her colleagues were staring at a monitor that showed nothing but white noise. Elena, you're fading. Sarah's voice was a ghostly echo. Sarah was now almost entirely opaque, her modern gear replaced by the heavy, oil-smelling wool of the past. She was nearly anchored. The heartbeat is the metronome. The collective consciousness of the SS Boreas crew whispered in Elena's mind. Captain Vance moved toward her. He wasn't attacking. He was stabilizing her. He placed his translucent, frosted glass hands over her shoulders. The moment he touched her, the two timelines collided in a physical shockwave. Elena saw his memories, the pride of the 1936 launch, the terror of the first reset, and the decades spent watching the world move on without them while they remained frozen in a 14-minute loop. We have to shift the phase. Elena gasped, her teeth chattering from a cold that wasn't thermal, but chronological. Sam, the radio, used the 1937 transmitter to broadcast the 2026 GPS signal. They knew Sam, the 1937 version of her friend, understood. He didn't have his modern tablet, but he had the massive, glowing vacuum tubes of the expedition's original radio. With his eyes still reflecting the violet aurora, he began to tune the massive black dials. He wasn't sending a voice. He was sending a coordinate, a here and now for the 21st century. As the radio hummed to life, the red light of the broken lens began to stabilize back into a blinding, pure white. The prehistoric forest outside vanished, and the void of the silence began to fill with the familiar sound of the Arctic wind. But the cost was becoming clear. The more Elena grounded the 2026 signal, the more the island's 1937 reality began to reject her. Her skin started to flake away into digital pixels, while the copper wires began to fuse with her veins. The loom is closing, Sarah shouted, her voice finally sounding solid again. She was flickering back into her orange thermal jacket. Elena, let go. If you stay connected when the reset hits, you'll be the one left behind. Elena tried to pull her hands away, but the machine wouldn't let go. It was hungry. It had been starving for a modern ground for 9 decades. The violet crystals were now wrapping around her knees, pinning her to the 1937 floor. One must stay, so the others can go. Vance's voice was no longer static. It was clear, tired, and profoundly human. He looked at the radio operator, the 1937 Sam. Then he looked at Elena. With a sudden, violent movement, Vance didn't pull Elena away. He stepped into her. He forced his 1937 existence into her 2026 frame, using his own anchor to push her out of the circuit. The feedback was a blinding explosion of violet and white. Elena felt herself being thrown backward, not through the air, but through time. The explosion didn't sound like a blast. It sounded like a glass cathedral shattering in slow motion. Elena felt a sensation of immense weightlessness, as if she were a single grain of sand being blown across a desert of decades. For a fleeting second, she saw Captain Vance's face, no longer frosted glass, but warm, weary, and smiling. He had traded his eternal loop for her freedom. With a bone-crushing thud, Elena slammed into cold, hard permafrost. The air was different. The ozone smell was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of a modern Arctic storm. She gasped for air, her lungs burning. As she struggled to open her eyes, she heard the frantic, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors and the shouting of voices over a digital radio. Elena, Elena, can you hear me? She looked up. Sarah was kneeling over her, wearing her bright orange thermal jacket. Sarah's face was flush with life, no longer translucent, no longer fading. Behind her, the Arctic sun was low on the horizon, not violet, but a pale, natural gold. Where's the camp? Elena rasped, her voice trembling. She looked toward the ridge. The 1930s canvas tents were gone. The brass-bound machine, the oak table, the copper kettle, everything had vanished. In their place was nothing but a scorched circle of earth, blackened as if hit by a massive lightning strike. There was no moss, no violet crystals, and no forest. It's gone, Elena, Sarah whispered, tears blurring her vision. The moment the pulse hit its peak, the whole sight just blinked out. It was like a movie screen being turned off. And Sam? Elena asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Sarah pointed toward the research vessel, the Borealis Echo, anchored in the bay. Standing on the deck was a figure in an orange jacket. It was Sam. He was alive. He was back in 2026. But as Elena watched him through her binoculars, she saw him staring at his hands. He wasn't moving. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the 79th parallel met the sky. 6 months later, the Svalbard expedition was officially classified as a localized electromagnetic event. The official report stated that the 1936 campsite had been destroyed by a subterranean gas release triggered by melting permafrost. Dr. Elena Rostova sat in her office at the university, staring at a modern digital photograph of the scorched circle. To the world, the SS Boreas was still a mystery, a ghost ship that never returned. But Elena knew the truth. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small object she had found in her pocket the day she was rescued. It was a 1936 silver Norwegian coin. It was warm to the touch. She looked at her wrist. The copper wires had left permanent, faint scars, not red or white, but a shimmering, iridescent violet that pulsed every 14 minutes. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a horological anomaly. Every time her pulse hit that 14-minute mark, the world around her would flicker. For a microsecond, the modern walls of her office would turn into the canvas of a 1930s tent. She would hear the faint, rhythmic scratch of a fountain pen and the smell of old coffee. Captain Vance and his crew hadn't been erased. They had finally been grounded. They were no longer trapped in a loop on a remote island. They were woven into the very fabric of time itself, existing in the spaces between seconds. Elena closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere, deep in the static of the universe, a 1937 radio was still broadcasting. And for the first time in 90 years, the message wasn't a cry for help. It was a signal of peace.